When I stood before those journalists and political analysts decades ago, defending our organization's relationships with leaders like Muammar Gaddafi, Fidel Castro, and Yasser Arafat, I knew that my words would be scrutinized, criticized, and perhaps misunderstood by those who viewed the world through the narrow lens of Cold War politics and Western diplomatic expectations. However, what I understood then, and what remains profoundly relevant today, is that true leadership demands the courage to maintain independent moral principles, even when the entire world pressures you to compromise those principles for the sake of political convenience or international acceptance. I have spent considerable time reflecting on that pivotal moment when I was challenged about our willingness to accept support from leaders who were considered pariahs by the Western world. And I realize now that this question struck at the very heart of what separates authentic leadership from mere political maneuvering. The journalist who questioned me that day was essentially asking whether we would abandon our supporters simply because they were unpopular with certain powerful nations, and my response revealed something fundamental about the nature of principled decision-making in the face of overwhelming pressure to conform to external expectations. Throughout my years of struggle against the apartheid system, I learned that one of the most dangerous temptations facing any leader is the desire to be universally liked and accepted, particularly by those who wield significant power and influence on the global stage. However, what I discovered through decades of imprisonment, negotiation, and ultimately governing a newly democratic South Africa is that leadership built on the foundation of seeking approval from others is inherently weak and ultimately unsustainable, because it requires constant compromise of core values and principles in order to maintain those relationships. When we accepted support from Gaddafi, Castro, and Arafat during our struggle against apartheid, we did so not because we endorsed every aspect of their governance or agreed with all of their policies, but because we recognized that they were among the few world leaders who genuinely supported our fight for human dignity and self-determination at a time when many Western nations were still maintaining profitable relationships with the apartheid regime. This decision required us to think beyond the simplistic categories of friend and enemy that dominated international politics during the Cold War era and instead focus on the fundamental question of who was willing to stand with us in our fight for justice. I understood that this position would be controversial and would subject us to criticism from those who believed that we should automatically adopt the enemies and allies of our preferred international partners. But I also understood that such an approach would have been a betrayal of our own moral authority and would have undermined our credibility as an independent liberation movement fighting for universal human rights. The moment we allowed external powers to dictate our relationships and alliances would have been the moment we ceased to be a truly independent organization and became merely a proxy for someone else's geopolitical agenda. This principle of maintaining independent moral judgment became even more complex when we had to navigate our position regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, particularly given the significant Jewish community within our own movement and the broader support we received from Jewish organizations around the world. I knew that our support for Palestinian self-determination could be misinterpreted as anti-Semitic, just as our inclusion of Jewish members in leadership positions could be seen as inconsistent with our support for the Palestinian cause, but I refused to accept such simplistic characterizations because they fundamentally misunderstood our commitment to universal human rights and self-determination. What I learned from these experiences is that authentic leadership requires the ability to hold multiple complex truths simultaneously without falling into the trap of binary thinking that characterizes so much of political discourse. We could support the Palestinian right to self-determination while simultaneously affirming Israel's right to exist within secure borders. Just as we could accept support from controversial leaders while maintaining our own independent moral compass and refusing to become mere instruments of their foreign policy objectives. The criticism I faced for these positions taught me that one of the most important qualities a leader can possess is the willingness to be misunderstood and even vilified in the short term for the sake of maintaining long-term moral consistency and strategic independence. There were countless moments during our struggle when it would have been easier to simply adopt the positions expected of us by our international supporters, but doing so would have compromised our integrity and ultimately weakened our movement's moral authority. Looking back on these experiences, I realized that the ability to maintain principled independence in the face of intense pressure is not just an admirable quality in leaders, but an essential requirement for anyone who hopes to create lasting positive change in the world. Leaders who change their principles based on political expediency or the expectations of their supporters may achieve short-term gains, but they ultimately lack the moral foundation necessary to build sustainable movements and institutions that can withstand the test of time. The lesson I want to share with anyone who finds themselves in a position of leadership, whether in politics, business community organizing, or any other sphere of human endeavor, is that the moment you begin compromising your core principles for the sake of maintaining relationships or avoiding criticism is the moment you begin losing the very qualities that make authentic leadership possible. True leadership requires the courage to stand alone when necessary, to accept criticism and misunderstanding as the price of maintaining your moral compass, and to trust that history will ultimately vindicate those who choose principle over popularity. Now, as you face your own leadership challenges in whatever sphere you find yourself, I challenge you to examine your own principles and ask yourself whether you are willing to defend them, even when doing so costs you support acceptance or immediate advantage. The world desperately needs leaders who are willing to stand for something greater than their own success. And that leadership begins with your decision to remain true to your deepest convictions, regardless of the pressure to compromise. Take action today by identifying one area where you have been tempted to compromise your principles for the sake of convenience or acceptance, and commit to holding firm to your values even if it means standing alone. Because authentic leadership always begins with the courage to be true to yourself and your deepest beliefs about what is right and just.